So good morning, welcome. I'm so excited to be here with everybody to celebrate the launch of Roxy in Australia with Jarrod Shusterman and Neal Shusterman, and in conversation with Mark Smith, who we just got to launch his newest novel recently as well. I'm Genevieve, I'm from Where the Wild Things Are, and I'm broadcasting to you from the land of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. If you haven't already gotten to get your hands on Roxy or Mark's new novel, If Not Us, we have them for sale for you today, of course, with 10% off. Or if you choose to get both If Not Us and Roxy, we'll be giving you a little bundle of 20% off for that one, which you can order on the website, and I'll link through to everyone very soon. If you have any questions, please send them through to us in the chat box. So that's in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. I will ask them of our authors closer to the end of the event. On to the fun stuff now. Mark Smith is an award-winning author. He lives, works, and surfs on Victoria's surf coast. The first book in his acclaimed winter trilogy, The Road to Winter, is widely taught in secondary schools and loved by readers of all ages. And Wilder Country, the second book of the trilogy, won the 2018 Indie Book of the Year for young adults. His new book, If Not Us, is a coming-of-age story about a small coastal town taking on a huge multinational company. Neal Shusterman is a New York Times best-selling author whose books include the acclaimed Arquebus Scythe series, one of my favorite series, and Dry, as well as the Unwind series and Challenger Deep, which won a National Book Award. He also writes screenplays for film and television for shows such as Goosebumps and Animorphs. He lives in Florida and has 4 children. One of those 4 children is Jarrod Shusterman. Jarrod is a New York Times best-selling co-author of Dry. He has a passion for storytelling across many mediums, with love and multiculturalism as an ethos. Jarrod writes and directs with his partner, Sophia, under their company, Dos Lobos Entertainment. Together, they enjoy traveling the world and learning new languages, living between LA and Spain. They can be found on Instagram at Dos Lobos Media. Will you all please join me with a nice wave and say welcome to our authors.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks very much for that. Jarrod and Neal, thank you so much for joining us. You're in different parts of the US at the moment?
Yeah, we are. He's in Florida and I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay, all right, good. So I'm sure that you get asked this question a lot, so we'll get it out of the way early on. And it's about the collaboration and how you actually work that. I've got a couple of follow-up questions to this as well, but being in different parts of the country, what's the genesis of a book, and how do you communicate with each other along the way? So maybe we'll let the senior, we'll let Neal begin the story.
Take it away.
Usually when we write, what we do is we get together to develop the story, so we feel comfortable enough to go our separate ways and work on it. But Jarrod had come to Florida to spend a week with me, and our whole idea was we were going to spend this entire week and come up with a story by the end of the week, come up with an idea by the end of the week. Turns out we came up with Roxy on the first day. And so the entire week was brainstorming and working out the story and getting all of the beats. And by the time we were done with that week, we pretty much knew all the major events that were going to happen in the story. And the idea, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say we knew that we were going to be writing about something that had to do with the opioid epidemic. And we're like, okay, how are we going to write a story about this that's unique, that's interesting, that hasn't been told before? We've read a lot of books about this topic, but they're really, really dark. Sometimes they're really hard to get through. So we're like, how can we bring a sense of at least misadventure to it? And my dad had this really brilliant short story that was told from the point of view of a gun in a school shooting. And we were thinking about it, and I said, what if we tell the story somehow through the perspective of the drug? How would that even happen? And my dad came up with the idea of, what if they're like gods?
Yeah, what if they're like the Greek gods? They exist in this eternal party in the sky, like Mount Olympus, and they come down to Earth to either help humans or destroy us. It could be either, because medications do both. And so we started to think of the different medications that have been so problematic in so many different ways and try to give them personalities. You know, if they had personalities, how would they respond to all of this? What would they be like? And so we realized that OxyContin would be Roxy. You know, she'd be beautiful and seductive. And when you fall for Roxy, you fall hard and she will not let you go. And the idea of telling this as a story of a toxic romance, that really made it connect because it was a very, very different way of addressing the issue.
Yeah. Well, maybe because we're there with Roxy now, there are really 4 protagonists in this novel. 2 being the drug gods, being Roxy and Addie, and then we have the 2 humans as well, the brother and sister of Ivy and Isaac. So maybe we might get Jarrod to introduce Ivy and Isaac to everybody, and Neal, if you can introduce Roxy and Addie. So we'll start with you, Jarrod. Can you tell us about your 2 human protagonists?
Sure. Well, our 2 human protagonists, we wanted to first off create characters that were relatable and that are the almost archetypes of people who do fall down the path of addiction. And, you know, the sad thing and the sad truth is sometimes they're like Isaac. And Isaac's situation is he was somebody who was he was never a troublemaker. He was, 4.0, great grade average, killing it in school, has a future, but then he hurts himself while playing soccer. And his grandmother gives him some pills. And then he gets them from the doctor. And then he finds ways. And slowly but surely, we really go with him down the path of addiction. And then you have Ivy, who's been dealing with ADHD for much of her life. And she struggles with her demons. And she's somebody who was really kind of recovering from dealing with a lot of tough issues personally. And then she falls down the path of Addison. And who comes out on top? Who is the one who survives? You'll have to read the book to find out.
Just before we continue on there, I have to give a nod to the character of the grandmother. The shoot from the hip grandmother. It is a fabulous character.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Neal, can you introduce us to Roxy and Addie?
Well, Roxy is at the top of her game. She is the hottest drug around. You know, when she walks into a party, everybody turns and looks, everybody's jealous, everybody wants to be her. And she is kind of predatory. She's like a shark. I mean, she comes down to earth to find those people who she can bring up to the party. And when she brings them up, when you go up to the party, chances are you're never coming back. You lose your life at this so-called party. Now, Addison, which is Adderall, has always been the good guy. He's always helpful. He's everybody's study buddy. He gets everybody through ADHD, and he's kind of tired of this image of being, the good guy. And he wants to party like, like his cousins, the Koch brothers and the other drugs who seem to just do nothing but have a good time and just throw people away after they're done with them. And so he sort of wants to be part of the popular crowd. Now his sister, Rita, who's Ritalin, tells him, you don't want that, Addie. You don't want to be like them. You're better than them. But, he has to come to that realization himself in the course of the story. Yeah.
Now there are a number of different voices in this book, and again, this comes to the collaboration. Did you each individually create a voice for characters, or did you manage to collaborate enough so that there's influences from both writers in those particular voices, especially those 4 characters we've spoken about?
Sure. When it comes to our characters, we just all write something. I'll start something, and then my dad will jump on and kind of tweak and go, let's take it this direction, or he'll start something. I'll jump on and tweak it. And we really kind of just blend our voices together pretty easily. And when it comes to the third person perspective, which is whenever we do things like, Isaac, the omniscient Isaac, or Ivy, that's really easy for us to do. that we don't have to talk anything about how to do that. But whenever it comes to characters, yeah, we talk it through a little bit, but I don't know, it comes really easy. I mean, I think it's not normal. And I think the main thing is because like he made me like in the first place. So he made me a certain way. So I automatically fit into his writing style a little bit. And I definitely know how to like emulate certain things that he'll do too. So we were able to find our niche together because we write very differently separate than we do together, but together we have a synergy that we feel really blends well.
So following that logic, it would be a very different thing for you to collaborate with someone who wasn't a member of your family.
Yeah, it would be. I think it would be quite different. I don't know. How would that even play out, Dad?
Well, I've done other collaborations, and some of them have been really, really great, and other ones have been not so great. I mean, it depends on how your personalities and your talents match up. And for you and me, everything just meshed really well. I mean, and when it comes to the characters, it started with Dry, where we came up with these characters, and both of us wanted to write from all the characters' point of view. And so, Jarrod came up with the character of Kelton and his voice. And then I said, well, let me do the next chapter from Kelton's voice. And then Jarrod said, let me do the next chapter that's in Alyssa's voice. And so we got the chance to do the characters' voices. And the thing is, we were both able to follow that voice once it was created. And so that really helped. We weren't stuck in writing a specific voice. We were able to track what the other one was doing. And so that's what makes it so that you can't really tell who wrote what, because it's really, we're really going back and forth through each chapter.
Only our editor can tell who wrote what. One of our editors, Amanda. But there was, something else to add too, to give a little more like, I guess, tangible explanations of how we build it. For example, we don't just write it and catch the vibe. No, we really talk. We kind of outline what are these character traits going to be. For example, when we were creating Henry in the previous book, Dry, the thought was I was reading all of these like Tony Robbins, like wealth books, and I was like super into like some self-help books, things like that. And I was thinking, what if there's a character who just talks like that? Like he's just always braggadociously, reciting these lines. And then my dad
went, ooh, what if everything that he says sounds like it is a college entrance essay?
So then it's like, okay, well, let's add that with, and we just added it with all of these things, certain things that actually, I guess I do sometimes, and then certain things that parts of my dad's character. And we just kind of created this character out of these 4, 5, 6, 7 traits that really made him. And then from there, we were able to both invent things independently that were super on track.
Yeah. So
and that works with all the characters, both in Dry and in Roxy. It was the same way.
Yeah. Okay. So from a reader's perspective, looking at this as a collaboration, you're still writing from 2 different generations, father and son. So here's your chance to dish a little dirt. Are you aware, did either of you pick any of the other's blind spots in terms of that generational thing, that maybe they just weren't switched on to this particular aspect of the character, or was there anything that came out in the writing process like that?
I think it's not necessarily generational. Maybe my dad will have an answer to that, but I think in just how we are as writers, for example, when I write, sometimes I try to go too fast. I first started writing screenplays, so I try to just plan it out and get it out there without really sometimes slowing down as much as I should. And sometimes my dad goes, hey, slow down this a little bit. And then sometimes my dad will write something, and I come from more of a mindset that's always cinematic. I feel like we're really our real competition aren't other books, but it's Netflix or your phone. That's who we're competing with for your attention. So I'm thinking, how can we make this cinematic? So then I'll see something that maybe my dad does and go, hey, listen, why don't we add more action in this moment? Not necessarily action, but try to make it feel more cinematic. So those are the 2 ways that I think we most kind of counterbalance each other. But as far as generationally, maybe there's some references sometimes where I'm like, I don't know what the hell that is. Or there's times where I'll write something and then I'll realize, oh crap, teenagers probably don't know what the hell that is. I'm old. And then I give up.
Okay, Neal,
not that old, but I guess I am. I don't know.
You know, I've always found that the trick is to not use anything that is too pop culture-y and not use anything that is going to be dated within a year or two. And
Yeah.
so there are certain things that are classic, that are universal, and I'm always trying to stick to that. But I remember, you know, when we first, you know, I wrote the first chapter, the opening chapter that sort of introduces it, and then Jarrod wrote most of chapter 2, which was when Isaac goes to find his sister at a party. And as I'm reading it, I'm seeing all the things that Jarrod is noticing would be at the party, and oh, that's interesting. And then I added a couple of things that I thought would be there, but it was kind of really interesting to see his, you know, younger perspective on coming into what it would be like to walk into this party.
Yeah.
And there were things that I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the idea of pop culture being so transient.
Yeah.
And you do need to be aware of dating your book very quickly, because you know that it'll move on very quickly. I also note, Neal, that you mentioned the short story that you wrote, which was about a collection about a school shooting. And
yes.
Am I right in thinking that your piece was a collaboration with another one of your sons?
Yes, that was a collaboration with my son, Brendan.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I am lucky to have the opportunity to work with Jarrod and with Brendan, and maybe with their sisters at some point.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So you've chosen to write a novel on a huge topic, the opioid epidemic in the US. Now, for those readers, now this particularly being you know, destined for the young adult market, can you give us like a brief overview of, for us here in Australia who may not be aware of the extent of this epidemic in the US, and just what the issues are that you are hoping to encapsulate in the novel?
Sure. Well, one of the main issues that we've been having in the United States is Oxycodone is just on the rise. And one of the main issues is that people will get hooked on this pharmaceutical drug and then realize it's much cheaper to go to heroin. And then you get a lot of heroin addicts from that. And the sad part is, this last year, before the pandemic, there were 75,000 overdoses that took place in the United States, which is a lot. And then we passed 100,000 just after the pandemic. So it went up by something like 30%. So it's this issue that's not going away because it's institutionalized. And that's why we needed to write a book that we hope that felt like we needed to institutionalize our own piece of literature to kind of at least combat that, or at least have people be aware. We're not telling people not to take some of these drugs. Some of these drugs are important, let's be clear, but you got to think about it, right? You got to go into it knowing what the hazards are. And I think a lot of people know what the hazards are. And it's easy to be told as a kid, don't do drugs, don't do drugs. I was told that all the time. But to watch somebody's story and to feel somebody's story, that's a different kind of context than just the blanket statement of don't do drugs.
I mean,
and one of the biggest problems with it is that, you know, people have in their mind the type of people who would become drug addicts, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is, you know, it's mothers and you know, and construction workers and people who hurt themselves in the workplace accident, and then start taking this medication for pain, and then become so dependent on the medication, and then once you become addicted to a painkiller, the pain of getting off of it is unbelievable. The withdrawal is terrible, and so people are getting addicted to it in these high amounts in communities that you would never expect. And the reason why they're going to heroin is that their insurance tells them they can't get it anymore. They can't get the more expensive medication. And because they're addicted, all they can do is go to something that's less expensive, which is heroin. And so then we end up with, you know, hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts. It's an absolute tragedy. And we need to be aware of how serious it is and not brush it under the rug and not think about it.
Yeah, and you probably need to explain too, because we're operating under a very different health system. We effectively have a universal health system here in Australia. But
That's
that's very
should.
different in the US,
Much
isn't it?
better. Yes, it's ours sucks. Yours is much better.
Yes.
Yeah, we're working towards getting a universal health system. We'll see how that works. But the health system that we have in America is difficult. I mean, you can get, if you have the world, you have a lot of money, you have a good insurance, you can really get some amazing procedures done, some experimental things. I mean, we have that in our country, but when it comes to just day-to-day basic normal people trying to get health insurance, trying to get healthcare, it can be quite difficult. It can be very difficult to get healthcare. So when you're dealing with a lot of people who are addicts, it's hard for them to really survive that and get past that, because we don't have a system that always is helpful to detoxify them and get them off the drugs.
Yeah, there's no safety net.
Yeah.
Especially another issue that we have too that we didn't really address in the book is an issue of homelessness. Because there is no safety net, a lot of them go to homelessness, and then also drugs can also often lead to a lot of triggering of mental illness. So we have a large epidemic of homelessness as a result of this miscare that we have in the United States.
So you're actually getting people addicted through legal prescription medication, but then they reach a point where that is no longer available to them. They're addicted to it, and so they go looking for how else they can support that addiction.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the book, because you've obviously come to this idea of wanting to present a story about the opioid epidemic. How do you? And I think you've done it brilliantly, and I want to pick your brains to find out how you did it. But how do you stop that being didactic? How do you stop it being preachy? Because these are, the humanity of these characters, it's heartbreaking what happens to them. So how do you achieve that balance without allowing the issue to guide the whole narrative?
Yeah, I think that it all comes down to the characters. The characters have to feel real. They have to be believable. You have to care about them, and you have to want to know what's going to happen to them. I think with any story, it always comes down to having characters that are big enough and relatable enough that the message can travel with them rather than overtaking them.
Yeah. Another thing too is, when we were writing this, we sat down and we're like, okay, this is kind of, a big swing for us. There's 1,000 ways to do this really wrong. We were aware of that.
Yes.
And it was like walking a tightrope to get to the finish line and do it the way where we both felt good. Because if we veered off the path a little bit, got a little too didactic in this sense, or thought of just one kind of not great idea, it could just, the whole thing could go wrong. So it was tricky in that sense. And we both and I feel like we found a way to kind of lead on each other's strength. There's moments where I'll see a scene and be like, Dad, this is yours. Like, right when things start to get a little bit surreal, when you can't tell what's the drug world and what's the real world, I was like, okay, Dad, we need you to get in here and do this. And there's scenes where my dad will go, oh, this is cinematic, and it's kind of action oriented, and there's a lot going. That Jarrod, you write this one, and then we'll take turns in that. But I don't know. I feel like I got off my train of thought.
No.
But read the book.
Well, Jarrod, what you said was interesting, because talking about walking that tightrope, we did the same thing with Dry.
Yeah.
We like to take on subjects that are that tightrope, where the challenge is creating that balance so that we tell the story and it doesn't feel didactic, it doesn't feel preachy, but it hits you so deeply that you're moved by it and you learn something from it, and it makes you think without making it feel as if it's being forced at you. And that balancing that tightrope is what is fun for us.
Yeah. And that's what I know. I remember what I was going to say. It's what's crazy about it is, we come into it with a little bit of an agenda. We go, okay, we want to inform, we want people to feel a certain way. But at the same time, I think the way to not be didactic is to really just sit and be honest. And you got to have some of those conversations, and you have to explore topics of marijuana isn't just bad. There's a lot of positive, transformative, aspects about marijuana. There's, some of these drugs that people are abusing, they weren't necessarily created in a bad light or with bad spirit, but they've been abused. So I think the main thing was just really trying to be as honest and objective as possible. We hope we achieved that, but that was the goal.
Yeah, I think I'm always wary about using the term didactic, because I think, in a sense, every novel is didactic to an extent, because you inevitably take a moral position through your characters. But I think, as Neal points out, it's how well you secrete that in the characters, so that you generate empathy for the characters, and then your reader hears that message from these people, these created people who they have empathy for, coming from them. As soon as they hear the author's voice, I think that's when you've gone too far as an author. Yeah,
that's so true.
I also think it's about posing questions rather than saying, we're the authors, we know the answers. What we're saying is, here's a problem. What do we do about it?
Yeah.
And so it's really posing the question to the reader and trying to look at that problem from all of these different perspectives, and basically saying, we don't know what the answer is, but if we think about it, if we look at it from all these different ways, perhaps you can come up with the answer.
Yeah. Can I ask a question about a couple of the decisions you've made in the way that you've written the book? The fact that you choose to write Roxy and Addie in the first person, and your two principal human protagonists, Ivy and Isaac, in what was effectively close third person. What was the thinking behind that decision?
We wanted to hear we started by thinking about the drugs and their voices and their personalities. And their first person voices came very easily to both of us. And we wanted a way to differentiate it from the real world. And we felt by changing tense, when you change from the world of the drugs to the real world, changing it to that third person, literally brought it down to earth. And so when we're in that third person, we're not going to see the drugs as characters. They're just going to be seen as drugs. It's going to be a very realistic portrayal of this brother and sister. It's only when we're in that first person point of view of the various drugs do we see them as individuals.
Yeah, it's true. And you feel when we chose to go through the drugs perspectives in first person, because we wanted the audience to really have a different ride. And this would be if you're going to tell the story, we felt this was the way to do it, to make it the most of a misadventure. We wanted the audience to be, these participant observers who are in the mind of Roxy and Addison. And when things go wrong, when you're often really close to the character, you sometimes can feel culpable, especially if you empathize with that character a lot and you like that character, you start to justify, okay, do I like him? Do I still like him? And then that makes you ask questions about Roxy and Addison themselves. It's that empathy that we try to create for them. Then readers have to go, okay, how on board am I? Do I believe their lies? Do I believe what they're doing? And that's up for the audience to decide.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that works particularly well is that crossover there, where, and I think the real power in this book is the way in which you show that it is sometimes it's the very small decisions that people make along the way, which end up having these massive ramifications. And by bringing the first person drugs into it, Roxy and Addie speaking directly to the character, to the human, you get that great sense of what's going on in the mind of someone who is not realizing that they are becoming addicted, but going with those small decisions. Would you like to comment on that?
And thank you for noticing that. One of the difficult things was when we were in the voices of in the drugs first person, when they were speaking to Isaac and Ivy, it needed to sound not like they were having a two-way conversation. It needed to sound like the voice inside your head, so that when Roxy says something and Isaac responds, it's as if it could be seen as him responding to that voice in his head.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing, the concept you bring in with uplining, who's my upliner from here? Can you explain that to us and the way that you used it?
Yeah, well, I always have known that there's these drug families, and they're classed in different ways. Every country has their own way of classifying them, but they're generally always classed in the same way. And I thought that was really interesting because we saw a correlation directly with that in the Greek gods. In the Greek gods, they have their hierarchy, so it was pretty inherent in it. And the word upline is something that like pyramid schemes use. So we just thought that would be an interesting way to pose it. It's on their upline.
Yeah. I guess this is a question you'll be asked a lot about this book. Is any of this inspired by personal experience of your own or of people that you've known?
I mean, as for me, I've seen a lot of people take drugs like, Adderall, and it's enhanced their life significantly. And then they stop taking it and they've learned to conquer their own ADHD. I've also seen other people who have abused it and gone down a bad path. And, I had a friend who passed away in the past year and a half while writing this book, who struggled with addiction, and it was just brought on by prescription medication. So it really did hit close to home. And it was really interesting because I realized that a lot of the characters I was naming actually had something to do with his life. I didn't even realize that until later on. But yeah, I mean, it was a personal story. And I think everybody knows somebody who's dealt with it, or at least been affected themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And Neal?
Yeah, I mean, Jarrod said it. Everybody, if you live long enough, you know somebody who died of an overdose.
Yeah.
And people who struggled, and then you wondered, did I do enough? Did I pull away from them because of who they had become, and could I have helped? And I think it affects not just the person who's taking it, but everybody who's connected to that person. That's one of the things we talk about in that first chapter, that how that when someone dies of an overdose, it's not just them. I mean, it is a fracturing pattern that has destroyed everyone around them to an extent. And it's a tragedy that needs to be addressed. One of the things we wanted to do with the book, again, this was a discussion that Jarrod and I had. We knew that one of the characters was going to die. Either Ivy or Isaac was going to die by the end of the book of an overdose. When do we let the reader know? Do we want that to be a surprise? And we decided that this was going to be the introduction. The first chapter, we are going to see somebody die of an overdose, but we don't know who. And that way, from the beginning what you're getting, but you don't know who. And so it becomes the journey of those two characters to find out who's the one who survives and how it all plays out.
Yeah, we tried to do it in that noir fashion of, who is it going to be? And also when we're dealing with these topics, something else I wanted to add is, it's controversial, the idea of, that addiction is a disease, and do you have a choice? And we didn't try in any way to take a position on that because at the end of the day, they're both true. But we also wanted to show that there is a life, there is a pattern, there is a way that people can lead to addiction and lead down this path. And these people did make choices along the way. And hopefully it can be empowering to know that there are different choices you can make.
Yeah. And I think you really highlight the fact that there are multiple paths to addiction.
Yeah.
It's not that stereotypical idea of the way a deadbeat falls into addiction to a prescription drug, but it is, as you mentioned earlier, it's everybody. It's out there, and it's in our suburbs, it's in our cities. Can I ask you? This is a book that's written for the YA market, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and for adults,
and for adults, yeah, and that's the point that I'm making, because I'm reading this as a YA author, but also as an adult, and I would read that as an adult book. But what considerations do you have in writing that then to ensure that it kind of gels within that young adult market as well, with the language that you use, the concepts that you discuss?
Well, people think that teens, people don't give teens enough credit many times. And I know, for myself, for everything that I've written, I never try to talk down to teens. I always expect them to rise to the level of what I'm writing. And, complicated concepts, if you put them before them, they get it and they appreciate it. And so I think that's, and I think what makes it young adult is that the characters are teenagers. The main characters are teenagers and talk like teenagers and think like teenagers.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think makes young adult books engaging even for adults is that, these are books about those moments that have changed, that change your life. The whole idea of coming of age, this is this little brief time in your life that has defined who you're going to be for the rest of your life. It's a very important time. And so it's important to write for that age group, and everything feels so much more intense in those years. And so it's a great age to write for because of that intensity.
Yeah. I mean, there's things that I'm writing that I know are going to be more shocking for a 16-year-old. I know that if I read that at 16, it would have shocked me more. It would have, there's the words can have more implications. And to go on, another thing that my dad was saying is, teenagers are smart. I mean, they're smart. I mean, there's some 13-year-olds or 12-year-olds who are smarter than full-blown adults. I mean, we all know that. And it just depends on who the person is. So we got to give them that credit. And I think, to answer your question a little more directly, there's, if there is some kind of sex scene, it's metaphoric. We don't go there. If there's a situation where you'd hear all the curse words in the book in real life, even from a teenager, we just don't go there. But we try to do it in a way that you don't realize, oh, wait, this did check all of the boxes of the young adult world. So wait, no one's going to ban us. But technically, we're talking about some really dark stuff. So, and some really messed up stuff. So
yeah,
I hope that we did our job correctly.
Yeah, I think you've done your job very successfully. I'm also interested in why it is that that it only seems to be young adult authors who get that thing that, no, these kids are smart, these kids are switched on, and it's just a matter of finding that, where we can tweak that switch, and if we're able to do that. I guess the other thing with that is, though, that with the young adult market, and I know here in Australia that the people who buy our books are not necessarily the people who read them, because we've got to get through the teachers, the librarians, the parents. They're the ones with the cash. They're the ones who are going to be buying the books, and yet they're giving them to their students, their kids. And so when you have a topic as big and as potentially scary as, I've just written a book about climate change, and I felt it very strongly there. With the opioid epidemic, is that a consideration for you, or is that something that your editor works with you on to ensure that as you say, Jarrod, that you are able to actually access that audience? There aren't barriers to that audience.
I think it's a partnership. When you're a young adult author, I mean, there's multiple markets. There's the direct to the kids market, which is the bookstores. But there's also the institutional market. There's the libraries and schools, and some authors will just appeal to one or just the other. Yeah. What we try to do is appeal broadly. I mean, we consider what we do a partnership with teachers and librarians and parents. And nothing pleases me more when a parent comes up and says, my kid read this book and made me read it because they wanted to talk about it. And we had this amazing discussion, and I never knew my kid thought that deeply.
Yeah. It's almost the ultimate accolade, isn't it, that you can get as a young adult author.
Well, when the kid likes it and the parent likes it, and then the kid still likes it after finding out the parent likes it, then we won.
Yeah. And then you have that crossover. You have that crossover book into an adult audience as well. Mm-hmm. Have you found when you've been interviewed about this that like you've written a fictional book about this big issue? Do you find now that in interviews you're being approached as, oh, well, you're an expert on the opioid epidemic, when in actual fact you've made up a story about it? How do you deal with that?
No one has accused us as being experts.
Not yet. Now it's going to happen. Now
They
that you
said we've
said
done
it.
our research well. That's the best. That's the comment we've gotten.
Yeah, yeah. I know authors here in Australia, we feel the same sort of thing. A friend of mine wrote a book about, a character who was homeless. And then he had radio stations calling him saying, would you like to come on and talk about homelessness with us? And well, you'd be better off talking to people running homeless services, but
Yeah.
it's that kind of sexy thing about it. Well, you've written a book about it, so you must know all about it.
Yeah, if it's questions about how the book's written, it's like, oh, we can speak, hopefully expertly about that. But if it comes to the actual factoids and the whole situation, we don't know it all. We did a lot of research, but we don't know it all.
Yeah, you've got to be upfront and honest, don't you?
Yeah.
You don't only ascribe characters to your two principal drugs, to Adderall and OxyContin. You have these interludes through the book as well, where you give first-person little interludes, as I said, to other drugs. And if I've got these right, I think we have Dusty and Charlie, the cocaine brothers. We have Lucy, I'm assuming LSD. And we have Phineas, morphine. We have Vic, who's codeine. Hyde, who's formaldehyde. Mary Jane, marijuana, obviously. What did you see as the point of having those interludes spaced through the book and giving a voice to those other drugs as well?
I mean, we did this with Dry in the sense of, is where it really started for us, is when we feel there's a world that is so big and the scope of our writing isn't going to touch everything. We're not really going to be able to go all the places that we want to go. We came up with this kind of system of going to these interludes or interstitials, where we kind of take these snapshots around the world so we can just get all these different perspectives. And we tried to write it and make it kind of a style of the book, so it felt germane and it didn't feel like it was just thrust upon us. And you meet these characters too in an organic way as well throughout the story. So then when you go and see them in the interludes, it's kind of fun. I mean, something that I always thought with this was the sensation of, I don't know if you guys all remember, but with The Nightmare Before Christmas, I loved when they went to that moment where they're standing there at all the trees and there's all these different worlds. You have the Thanksgiving world, all of them. You have the Christmas world. You have that. It's like that. And once you see that, it's like, I want to go see all of them. So we chose to take everyone to all of them.
Yeah.
And there was also coming from a theatrical background, I wanted to do something that felt, theatrical. In Dry, it was actually it was the opposite. Those interstitials were third person, because the rest of the book was in first person, and the first person segments with the different drugs all kind of felt like theatrical monologues. I mean, you could see them on a stage, and I think that was part of the allure of them, was to sort of have these drugs get the chance to have their day on stage and their moment on in front of in the spotlight.
Is this where you think your experience for both of you of script writing comes to narrative fiction as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think everything you do feeds into everything that you write, and everything that you've learned, everything you've experienced in one way feeds into it. And having written scripts, I know, Jarrod, having written scripts, comes at it from that point of view, from that very, very visual way. And, like he said, when it comes to writing action sequences, I stand back and I let him do it, because he really has that rhythm down.
Yeah.
Well,
when it comes to intersection, that's kind of where I start to focus.
Or when things get kind of surreal and we get into this other world, I love seeing how you've written those things in the past. So I'm like, as a fan, I'm like, okay, you do this. But yeah, growing up, it's funny how I started writing in the first place was I wanted to do, all my dad's friends would ask me, what do you want to do when you grow up? Do you want to be like your dad? And I was like, no, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm going to be a film director. So I'd make all these movies. And then one day I realized they really sucked. And I realized I needed to come up with a story. So I kind of asked my dad for help and learned how to script write as a teenager. And then it wasn't until, maybe I was 20 or so, I really didn't get into prose, but I had been screenwriting so much. Me and my dad had a project together in Hollywood. So it was like, my dad was like, hey, Jarrod, you're good at this. We should just, you could do this. And I'd never even had considered. So then, okay, let's go into it. And then that's where we are. But yeah, so I think things do just naturally come out in that kind of cinematic way, or in a way that if you ask enough questions, the answer will always be, oh, it kind of could lend itself to a stage play or lend itself to a movie, because that's just how we think. And I like to think that that's a fun way to tell a story, a different way, and definitely on par with our biggest competition, Netflix, because they're tough.
Yeah. I'm interested.
Jarrod, you told me that one line you said that about what is Netflix's competition? What was that?
Yeah, Netflix's competition isn't Hulu or Disney Plus. They said their biggest competition is sleep, which is pretty creepy. So I'm just thinking, I get text messages all the time. Maybe I've already gotten like 5 or 10 since we've been talking. And it's like, how can I compete with that? Like, and now imagine people who were born with phones in their hands.
Yeah.
I got it around 13, 14, right when it was a new thing. I had T9 texting. I didn't have an iPhone right when I was 13. So it was, it's just, I can't imagine being born with that and having that be a part of you. And then having the patience to read a book. I mean, I don't know if I would really have the patience. So we just want to create something that is just as grabby as possible and as attention holding as possible.
Great. Look, we're fast running out of time here. This has gone so quickly. But Jen, I know you have some questions from the audience. So if you wanted to ask those, and then I've got a heap more, but we can go to the audience.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Neal and Jarrod. This has been amazing. I have a question initially from Bren McDibble. She says, Neal, love your novels. Some of the topics of your recent novels, the tightrope topic, seem to walk a line close to being too much for the gatekeepers of YA. A debut author could probably never go there. Is it a trust you'd built up over several novels? And do your editors ever get in and flat out say no?
The editors never flat out say no. And if I ever go too far, they'll say, are you sure you want to do this? Here, there was one point at which we have something here. I don't know if you have it there, but we have the school book fairs, and one of the biggest school book fairs is Scholastic. And in one of the books, I was going to have the character drop an F-bomb, and my editor said, well, you can do that if you feel that it's absolutely necessary, but if you do that, we will not have a sale to Scholastic book fairs. So is that word worth losing the sale to Scholastic book fairs? And the choice was up to me. And I took the word out because I didn't want to lose all of those books for Scholastic book fairs. So in terms of the gatekeepers, I try never to do anything that is really going to make them not want to carry the book. There's always going to be people that want to ban books. There's always going to be people who say, not only should my kid not read this, but I should, because I don't agree with it, nobody else should read it. That's the problem that we have with book banners. They don't want to prevent their kid from reading it. They want to prevent everybody's kid from reading it. And there's the problem. And so, books will be challenged, and most of the time the gatekeepers will defend and support those books. And usually what happens is when the people who are fighting about them actually read the books, they realize that the book is not the problem they think it is. At least, I always hope that reasonable minds prevail.
Can I just add something, add a question onto that and jump in? And that is that, particularly for you, Neal, you've been writing for a long period of time. Is it and given what we see as the sort of quite a polarized society in the US compared to maybe 20 years ago, is that do you see that as a different market to be writing into now?
The polarization in the United States is a huge, huge problem. And I try not to play to the polarization. I try not to create further polarization. But at the same time, I don't pander. I'm not, and I think Jarrod is, it's the same. We're not going to write something that we're going to be afraid that it's going to offend half the population.
Yeah.
We want to tell the truth as we see it. We want to pose the questions as best we can. And we're not going to be frightened by the fact that it might offend people that we're posing these questions.
I mean, for example, you know, the opioid epidemic and just the drug epidemic that, you know, every country has their level of it. It's never a good thing. That's pretty bipartisan and pretty international. So we try to pick topics that everyone's on board with.
But then we did Dry, which is definitely about climate change. And in the United States, there are still those climate change deniers.
But they don't read books. So it doesn't matter.
Or if they read it, they don't realize that they're reading something about climate change.
Jen, have you got another question? You just need to come off mute, Jen. Yeah, you're back.
I'm back. Okay. Brent actually had a second question that I think fits well into this conversation. And particularly of what you said, Neal, that like an F-bomb wasn't allowed in this instance. And her comment is like the Scythe's murder and violence is that, but that's not off limits. And she thinks in the Australian market that we're more okay with sex and swearing in YA than we are with novels that have kids carrying out government sanctioned murder. And she's wondering perhaps, and I think this carries to all the authors here, do you think that's a cultural difference, particularly to do with gun violence in the US versus Australia, perhaps?
Of course. I mean,
I think it's a cultural difference.
Oh, are we
Jarrod,
having a
go on.
lag and you're letting me talk now? Okay, I'll
No,
talk. So, I'm jumping on the lag here. I think, I mean, from what I found, I also write, as Mark was saying before, I also write with my partner, Sophia, and she's from Spain. So I've really gotten a chance to see what it's like over there. And over there, they have no problem talking about sex or cursing in just on television and daytime television. So I think it is cultural. There is a certain level of sensitivity on certain things that will make it YA or not. When it comes to international markets, I think it'll always be that way.
Yeah. And
also, it's also when it comes to something like you were talking about Scythe, there's a level of responsibility that I have when I'm writing about that. If you'll notice, there is not a single Scythe that uses a gun to kill. They can. It's part of the thing. These are, bullet, blade, and bludgeon. Those are the three ways. But you know what? None of the Scythes that we see use a gun. And that was intentional. I did not want to show that. I did not want any of our characters to be holding a gun. And that was very important. Whereas in Dry, there is this very major scene where there's a family that's a gun family, and there is a horrible accident in which a family member is accidentally shot. And it is intended to be gut-wrenching, because we felt it's that whole live by the gun, die by the gun. The family was had lots of guns, and this terrible thing happened. It was our statement against the proliferation of weapons.
But again, the statements that we'll make, it's show, not tell. The statements that we make will come through situations that happen, but they're not going to come through our direct voice explaining it to anybody. And often, if you're on the other side of gun control and you think that this American Second Amendment is the best thing in the world and God's gift to man, then you will read that book and you'll probably find a way to still be comfortable, even if we're making statements, because we're never saying them so loudly.
But hopefully we're making those people question it.
Yeah.
Deep back where they don't realize.
Yeah, hopefully.
Thank you. Kate Saunders was saying, Neal, I've read many of your books and they all bring to life issues that seem so impossible, but also terrifyingly possible. I always appreciate the way Zoom allows people to be very articulate in their questions. So maybe they are just around the corner, unwise, Scythe, etc. Do you look back at any of your work and feel that you've predicted the future?
All the time. I mean, Jarrod, Jarrod and I are constantly talking about this with Dry, because we keep seeing these news articles about stuff that's happening with the water system and the failure of the Colorado River to provide water, and it's mimicking what happened in the book.
I mean, in South Africa, there was day zero that almost happened 3 years ago. And we wrote Dry before that happened, just when it was a what if that kind of thing could happen. And luckily with day zero, they didn't quite get there to the point of society completely collapsing, but they were real close. And it's something that we realized is going to happen. You have like Mexico City, you have Rio de Janeiro, you have, Cape Town, California is one of them. All within the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to run out of our aquifers are going to run dry. And we'll really get to day zero situations. We called it the tap out. We came up with that name, the tap out, but the news called it day zero in real life.
Yeah.
And then there was the raids on Costco at the beginning of the pandemic that just were like an exact duplicate of what happened in Dry. It was eerie.
We didn't foresee the toilet paper thing. I don't know if that happened in Australia too. What's with the everyone went for the toilet paper? It made no sense. We didn't foresee that. No.
Stafford was wondering, so when I was reading, I felt that the story would work for screen. Is it possible that Roxy will become a TV series?
We're waiting to see. Our agents and manager are priming the entertainment industry to see, for it. The reviews have been very good. The sales are doing really well. And so we're waiting for that right producer, that right director to get involved. We had Dry was picked up by Paramount, and now we have other investors that are working that are interested in it. Scythe is in development with Universal. Unwind is in development also, but that was Universal Films. Unwind is in development with Universal TV. And so most of the books that either I've done or Jarrod and I have done have had a life in terms of development for the entertainment industry. So we're hoping Roxy will too, but whether they get made or not, that's completely out of our control.
That's just the entertainment industry being the way it is. And, it's interesting how certain books have more likelihood of getting made than others. A lot of people don't think this, but when you look at something and the budget that you think about, what would the budget be of this? Is it possible to tell this story if it's a big story? That makes it harder to make, obviously, because it means the bill is going to be 50 million to do it well. But something like Roxy, it's a dark subject matter. So for somebody to take the leap of faith, it needs to be somebody who's really passionate. So we've come to the conclusion that it's going to be a writer or director who will be the one that really, or a production company that really feels that creative passion to really jump for it, because it's a jump down the rabbit hole. So yeah, we'll see what happens with all of them. My dad's got a great track record with Dry so far. I've got a good one, so we'll see what happens.
Jarrod, you mentioned liking to write cinematically a few times. I was wondering if you could explain to us like a little bit what that means for you, or how you write cinematically.
Sure. For me, that means literally writing it as if you're watching the movie. So the way that a scene will be paced out, the scene will be paced out in a cinematic or movie-esque feeling, where you have the beginning of the scene continues on, and then suddenly you have this problem, and then you have to solve this problem your characters have to take a new course of action to solve it. But then the world gives you this opposite expectation than you would have ever expected, and then you have to overcome that, and then there's a bit of resolution, and then at the end the values of the scene have changed a little bit. Maybe now you started the scene in a negative way, and now you've ended in a positive way, or vice versa. So there's just kind of just the interworkings of the technicalities of how you do a scene, a 5 to 6, 7 minute scene. And then beyond scenes, you have these sequences, and beyond sequences, you have acts. So it's almost like writing the book in this way that feels like it follows that structure, and that you can visually see it when you read it. You feel like when you're reading it, you actually are seeing a show or a movie, and you're seeing it in a very visceral way. Maybe not getting too caught up in just the thoughts, the inner thoughts. You could have 3 pages of some books that are just talking of, the character in their head, explaining things. And I could just read forever the thoughts of an author like Kurt Vonnegut. I mean, I could just read his thoughts, but that's not necessarily, the style that I love, at least to do myself. Thoughts are great, but I want to see it. I want to live it. I want to be there,
And there are times when, when I'm going over seeing the Jarrod's written, and I think, you know, this needs to a little bit of rhythm in here. Let's put in maybe a paragraph of the thoughts of the character before we move on. And so I'll tweak that. That's the way that I would tweak some of those scenes.
Yeah, he'll
And then-
extrapolate upon those
Yeah,
moments.
and then he'll take the scenes that I've done too much thinking and too much introspection and figure out where to fit the action in there.
Brilliant.
And by action, we don't mean like things that exploding or like people running,
Yeah.
but action like things happening. You know, what is like the emotional change?
Things
What
moving the
is
story,
emotional
yeah,
change?
moving the story
Yeah.
and the characters forward.
Yeah. I think we've run out of time.
Oh,
I thought I might just sneak in one last question, naughtily,
sure.
because I've
Go
just been
ahead.
wondering it quite from the beginning. I was just really intrigued, Neal, because I in Challenger Deep, you're also looking at like medication and the cocktails of drugs a lot. And I found it quite interesting that you're exploring it in such a different way in Roxy. And I was just curious if there was any reflections that came through for Challenger Deep or just between the two books.
I think that the biggest connection, it was the surreal world, and what I was able to do with Challenger Deep when it came to writing the surreal stuff in Roxy, because I had done that before, it made it a little bit easier to make that transition from the real world to the surreal world and make it smooth enough and hopefully not too confusing to the reader, that the reader bought into both worlds. And so it was more what I learned writing Challenger Deep, I was able to apply in working on Roxy.
Well, thank you both so much. And thank you, Mark. This has just been such a wonderful conversation. Everyone's such marvelous storytellers. And thank you everyone
You're
for
very
joining
welcome.
us.
It was great. Thank you so much, Mark, for asking totally unique questions.
Great questions.
You know.
Great. I really look forward to doing the interview. I'm really happy you've enjoyed it as well. It's great insight.
yeah.
Thank you
Very
for
much so.
Thanks. And I'm just going to ask everyone to unmute if you'd like, and we can just have a wee round of applause if it works out. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you so much,
evening
everyone.
and
Yeah.
good morning.
Yeah.
Thanks.